Hello there, my name is Luke Jennings. I'm VP of R&D at Push Security, and welcome to my webinar on Scattered Spider, where we're going to look at the TTP evolution of Scattered Spider in 2025. So, quick agenda before we move on. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at the background on Scattered Spider. We'll then consider how their TTPs have evolved over time, and then we'll kind of deep dive a little bit on their latest TTPs, and then we'll consider some practical recommendations of what people can do about it. And finally, we'll spend a little bit of time at the end just looking at how Push can help in this space as well. So first of all, why am I talking about this? So this is quite an interesting one for me because it's a topic close to my heart because almost 2 years ago now, I released the SaaS Attacks Matrix, which was inspired by the MITRE ATT&CK framework and was focused on sort of identity-first SaaS native attacks. So like, how do you compromise an organization without touching the endpoint? And that was partly driven by the change in technology that had gone this way and opening the question of like, how do you attack organizations that only operate this way? But it was also driven partly by the early signs of attacks in this space. And Scattered Spider really fit into this space and have really evolved a lot into it over these years. So they're a particularly interesting threat actor to me as well. And so I'm talking about this because I've spent a lot of time researching these types of attacks over the years, and it's interesting now seeing threat actors like Scattered Spider moving into space. So that's why I'm talking about this, but why are you here? Ultimately, I know there's a good chance that 75% of people that attend this webinar right now have attended related to the fact that Scattered Spider have really hit the news a lot recently due to the very, very high profile breaches in the UK retail sector, principally of Marks and Spencer's and Co-op. And we've seen all these crazy headlines, of course, and it's a huge hack. M&S alone are saying they're expecting to lose at least 300 million for this. And interestingly, their cyber claim, I think, is going to be 100 mil because I think it's capped at that. So you would think that would be a pretty big insurance claim to max out at. But obviously in this case, unfortunately, it's been a damaging enough attack for them that they're going to be going beyond that. So those are the headlines, and obviously this is something that's hit people outside of cyber. People have noticed the impacts of this in terms of the supply chain and delivery problems that have caused by this, empty shelves and so forth. So this is very much front and center. But what actually happened at a very technical, kind of high level, we obviously don't know all of the details because this is an ongoing breach right now. But from what we do know, essentially it started with a help desk scam, and that was used to achieve initial access. So the attackers posed as an engineer to reset a password and MFA. That eventually led to compromised Entra accounts and access being obtained to common tech platforms like IM platforms like Teams, email, SharePoint, that kind of thing. And eventually they end up at the point where they're extracting the ntds.dit from the Windows Domain Controller and using that to extract passwords and escalate privileges. And finally, sort of end of the chain, they're deploying DragonForce ransomware directly to VMware servers. And that's where a lot of the disruption came from. So is this new? The reality is no. Actually, if we look back to, say, 2023, a previous victim of Scattered Spider, the MGM hack looks very similar. It started with a help desk scam, gaining an initial access, in this case using employee details that was stolen online and then resetting creds and MFA. They ended up getting super admin positions in Okta by doing this, registered malicious tenants, started impersonating users, and eventually laterally moved to Azure, gaining global admin permissions, and that enabled them to traverse to the cloud-hosted VMware environment. So at this point, they deployed ransomware as well, a different type of ransomware at the time, but they ultimately still deployed ransomware to VM servers. So if you look at these things, they're 2 years apart, but actually at a high level, the technical details share a lot in common. So this is something we've seen before. This is not really new. So with that in mind, if you take a step back and look at the bigger picture, ultimately, Scattered Spider have been pretty active the last few years. These are just the public victims since 2022. So that's a lot of breaches, right? And so Co-op and M&S, like they are just the latest breaches, and they've gained a lot of publicity from it. But ultimately, This is not new. This is not the first victims. And these are the public breaches. There's going to be a lot more private breaches as well. So the number of victims in reality is obviously higher than this. So Scattered Spider have been using similar techniques and active for a while. It's not just the recent co-op and M&S breaches. So what's the 101 on Scattered Spider? Like, who are they? What are they? Everyone knows attribution in the cyber world is very, very difficult, but within the confines of that, I would say that Scattered Spider effectively have come to be known as an English native-speaking criminal collective. So that's impacted the targets and techniques they've used. So we've kind of principally seen them mostly active in English-speaking Western countries. Like, according to Mandiant, it's not completely limited to that. There is evidence of them operating outside of that as well. But a lot of the focus has been on particularly US and UK victims. They're motivated effectively by financial gain. So this has mostly been through data theft, extortion, and ransomware, that kind of thing. And Scattered Spider is one name, but obviously this is not what they call themselves. This is what analysts call them. They've been tracked as other groups by different companies as well, like Octotempest, Octopus, Muddled Libra, and so forth. And ultimately their targets are generally large enterprises, but they've been across quite a lot of different sectors. But that's pretty much the sort of 101 of who they are, what they're doing. But what's the kind of reality here? I mean, they're not really a fixed group. It's a collection of individual operators kind of working together. They don't call themselves Scattered Spider. It's the analysts that do, as I said before. Now, we've seen some arrests related to this. So this has been tied back to who's behind the keyboard with regards to law enforcement towards the end of last year. But that's obviously not stopped them. So at the very least, they didn't get everyone. But I think the key thing to understand here is that as time evolves, we're kind of trying to attribute these by looking at the types of attacks and how they're conducting them. Now, over time, these will be emulated, more people use them. There's no guarantee you tie back to the same people. So I think increasingly over time, Scattered Spider is going to be really referring to types of attack techniques that look similar, more so than necessarily being the exact same individuals responsible each time. But ultimately, from what we have seen, they've been very young, adaptable attackers, kind of grown up in the modern internet area, not focused on old school network hacking. They're very much using modern attack techniques. They're very cloud conscious, identity centric in their approaches. And that's what's really differentiated them from a lot of other groups previously. So what are the TTPs used in public breaches? So this paints another picture, which is quite interesting here, because we've seen a little bit of an evolution. So there's more than this, but I'm looking at the kind of delivery vectors here at the initial access phase and looking at how really in 2022, we saw things starting out with like phishing, but then also sort of moving into other delivery vectors like smishing and vishing as well. And then the sort of help desk element came along. So we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. And if you were to look just at the public breaches, you think, okay, they just completely solidified on help desk abuse and attacks. So it does look like that from the public breach perspective. We're going to see later how that's not quite true. There's evidence of other attacks that they've evolved into as well. But help desk attacks have definitely been a key part of what they're doing and a key part of the recent attacks. So let's consider the kind of evolution of these TTPs. So you think at the very beginning, some of the earliest examples we saw was them just sort of doing basic credential phishing and even smishing for generally Okta as a target. And obviously, if you just do a simple credential phishing where you're sending credentials that you capture off to a Telegram channel like they were in their case, ultimately this is defeated by any MFA method, right? But if there's no MFA, you get in, or at least gives you the password to then start to try to launch MFA bypass attacks later. But really, if we look at the evolution of their attacks, that's what it's been based around. It's been finding better ways to bypass MFA over time. That's the evolution of their TTPs, really. So what we first saw then was two kind of MFA bypass techniques in the early attacks. We saw SIM swapping used as a technique to capture text-based MFA codes that are delivered by SMS. So by performing SIM swapping attacks, they were able to circumvent this form of MFA and compromise accounts that way. We also saw the use of like push bombing attacks or MFA fatigue attacks, depending on your favorite way to call them. But basically, spamming push-based MFA notifications to your targets until they get annoyed and eventually accept one on their phone thinking there's some sort of problem. But these are both defeated by sort of one-time passwords, but delivered by apps. So you can't SIM swap, and you can't just get someone to accept a notification. You need to actually get the code, and you need to get it from the app. Which kind of led to phase 2, where we saw, a little bit of phishing originally, where there'd be social engineering that involved going after a target user and getting them to give up their MFA code as well. But really this evolved most prominently into the help desk scams. And there was a realization there, I think, that with a help desk scam, not only could they bypass MFA, but they could actually access any user account they wanted. So here's one really interesting aspect about help desk scams. Since most organizations have the same reset process for like every account, ultimately you can kind of go straight after high privileged accounts from the beginning. Whereas when you're dealing with phishing, if you think about phishing, right, if you go after the easy targets, the people that are more susceptible to it, they generally tend to be the people that don't have high privileges on a network. Whereas if you go after the highly technical admin users that have got all the privileges you want, they're less susceptible to phishing. Doesn't mean they can't fall for it, but they're a much harder target. But with help desk scams, you're tricking the person on the help desk, and help is in their name as well. Their whole purpose is to be helpful. But the account you gain access to can be any account. You could ask for a low privilege account, or you could ask for an enterprise admin, and it may not impact the process. So ultimately what happens, an attacker just calls the help desk impersonating a user. And there's nothing fancy. Normally it's something very simple, like a normal everyday process that you would expect going through help desk. So it'd be like, hey, I lost my phone. I need to reset my MFA, or, I bought a new phone. I need to reset my MFA, and they'll go through the process with help desk there. And that may involve, a reset link being sent via email or SMS. Now, if they're doing SIM swapping, they can maybe hijack that via SMS. Or part of the social engineering process may be supplying a personal email or a new phone number as part of that in order to obtain this reset link. So that gets the attacker the MFA reset if they're able to bypass that process. In some cases, they may already have the target's password from previous phishing attempts. In other cases, they may use the access they already obtained to leverage self-service password reset functionality to then bypass the password component as well. And effectively, in the end, the attacker then logs in and takes over the account. But the key thing is, you can go straight after those super privileged accounts. So they can potentially go from 0 straight to like super admin if they're able to target the correct account. And that's how the help desk scams have been working. So what's the industry response to this been? Now, of course, the logical reaction is to focus on that particular attack to begin with and think, okay, how do we fix our help desk vulnerabilities? How do we secure the process here? This is obviously a good step. It's a great step. Everyone should be doing this. It's a typically neglected area, but it's easy to over-index on this and not see the whole picture. Ultimately, there are other attacks at play. So let's consider another phase. Attacker in the middle phishing. We've seen Scattered Spider using these kits in the wild as well. We'll come to why later, but ultimately, they may not have been key components of the public breaches out there, but there's definitely lots of evidence out there of them using them in attacks. So let's start with just what is attack in the middle phishing if you're not already familiar. Ultimately, it's another way of bypassing MFA. So attack in the middle phishing was created specifically to deal with this problem. Traditional credential phishing just got a password, MFA defeated that. So instead, attacker in the middle phishing routes traffic effectively through a proxy server to a real target. So a victim clicks a phishing link, then they're talking to an attacker's proxy server, and it looks to them like they're talking to Microsoft or Okta or Google or whatever their identity provider or other platform they're logging into is. And then the proxy server just redirects the traffic in the middle. So they enter their password, and it then also prompts them for their MFA code, and it keeps passing back and forth until they're successfully logged in. And the key point then is that the session is what is stolen by the attacker in the middle server. So you steal the cookies, that enables you to hijack the session, and therefore you bypass MFA. Now, attack in the middle phishing has kind of exploded in general in the last year or two. So it's very common to see this, particularly targeting Microsoft. Microsoft's probably by far the most commonly targeted platform for this, and Microsoft themselves have reported this. But ultimately, it works against anything, and we've seen ScatterSpider using it. So I'm going to show an example quickly of an open source tool for this that's actually been used by ScatterSpider too. Then we'll look at the specific examples that they've implemented. So we're looking at EvilJinx here. EvilJinx is open source, but there's also effectively a commercial version available for sale now. So it's intended for kind of red teamers to use. And ultimately, you can target any app with this. I'm using Microsoft as an example. So you can see on the left is my victim, on the right is my EvilJinx server. And the EvilJinx server is doing this proxying. So my victim sees what looks like a Microsoft login page, but you can see that it's actually a pushdemos.com domain. But it looks and behaves exactly like the real Microsoft page. So I go and I enter my password, and it's not just there, like that password does get captured by EvilJinx, but the process continues and it goes and prompts me for my app-based one-time password. I go to my app on my phone, I get that one-time password, enter that too. I'm then logged in successfully. I can then go and access Outlook and OneDrive and all my other files if I want to, and it will behave as normal. But the key is the EvilJinx server has captured all of this, and while the one-time password is no longer useful after the short amount of time it's valid, the session itself, the cookies that I've stolen, the tokens that have been captured here, they are what's valuable. So then, as an attacker, you can take these tokens, re-import them into another browser, and hijack the session, and that's the method by which you bypass MFA. Okay, so that's an example. Let's look at what ScatterSpider have done with it, and they've actually used EvilJinx. So here's some examples that were spoken about by Silent Push. They did a good article on this recently. So like they did in the early days where they were phishing for Okta creds and impersonating Okta, they've done that again more recently, targeted different brands, but they've been doing it with a more sophisticated EvilJinx attacker in the middle kit instead of just harvesting passwords. So these are all examples, and these are similar to things they did years ago, as in that they've got some sort of domain that's got Okta in the title, but it isn't, the real domain, classic phishing stuff. That's what they've been doing. Second to that, we've also seen another domain trick, which is the use of rentable subdomains sometimes too. So normally if you register a domain with a TLD, that appears on the Whois record and so forth, and you've got to pick which domain you want. Rentable subdomains are where someone's almost operating a domain like it's its own TLD. So for example, in this case, it.com is a registered domain of the com TLD. But the owners of that have made that rentable, so you can rent a subdomain of it. Now, they use this to impersonate Klaviyo here, and it's actually really useful for making very similar domains to your target. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this particular trick is because I'm going to show you something that we saw at Push and how lots of things line up that are similar. So, fairly recently, we stopped a malvertising attack that involved EvilJinx for one of our customers. In this case, it wasn't impersonating Okta. Someone was impersonating on Fido. But the interesting thing is they used malvertising to do it. So they sponsored a Google ad. And on Fido is a brand that's been known to be impersonated by ScatterSpider in the past as well. If you're not familiar with them, they're basically like a digital identity verification system. So what happened here is we had a customer that have actually been knowingly targeted by ScatterSpider before. They browsed to this, searched for on Fido, clicked the top link, and as you can see, there's a rentable subdomain, but it's us.com, not it.com. And so this is pretty interesting because any one of these things on their own doesn't indicate ScatterSpider, and given this is attribution, there's no 100% here. But you've got something that's targeting non-Microsoft for a start. It's not Okta in this case, but it's a brand that's been impersonated by ScatterSpider before. It's using a non-standard delivery vector, which is commonly performed by them too. In this case, they're using malvertising. They're specifically using EvilJinx, and it affected a target that's been affected by ScatterSpider before. So there's a whole bunch of things that are lining up, plus the rentable subdomain. When you put all those things together, I didn't realize it on the day, but with other articles and research that's come out since, in retrospect, I'm pretty sure this attack was ScatterSpider too, and they were going after the supply chain of people using this. Okay, So then the question becomes, why attacker in the middle? Why would they do this if they're having so much success with help desk attacks? Well, ultimately, it's a different method, achieves the same goal, and just has different pros and cons. Both the help desk attacks and attacker in the middle phishing are ways of achieving the same goal, which is bypass MFA and therefore achieve account takeover. So just like help desk scams can reliably do that, we reliably bypass MFA when it works properly. We've also got out-of-the-box solutions like evasion, and that's what we've observed Scattered Spider using. There are other criminal kits out there too that implement attacker in the middle phishing, but evasion is a common one. It also evades security controls at the endpoint and network layer. And in general, that's something we've seen Scattered Spider doing. They're focusing on identity attacks. They're avoiding your sort of traditional endpoint attacks and network attacks, because that's where most of people's controls are. And this is where we sort of compare and contrast with help desk scams. Yeah, so consider help desk scams. They are basically pretty high cost. You know, you've kind of got to give away at least your voice fingerprint, which potentially puts you at risk as a person. And there's effort involved in conducting them. They don't scale very well. So you've kind of got to expose yourself a little bit more than your conventional cyber attack. Because normally with cyber attacks, it's very difficult from a law enforcement perspective to get back to a named individual that can be prosecuted. But when you start getting phone calls involved, which are always recorded on help desks normally, there is a higher risk there. On the other hand, attacker in the middle phishing pretty much flips this round. Like a conventional cyber attack, it's actually quite sort of low cost, low risk for an attacker, but it's also much more scalable. So different set of pros and cons. So it's another method of achieving the same goal. So when you think of it like this, it becomes clear why they're interested in doing it as well. So in summary, what we've seen in terms of their attacks is that ultimately we've got various different techniques focused on achieving MFA bypass that leads to account takeover. So they're identity-focused attacks, bypass MFA, get account takeover. So we've seen that with help desk scams, we've seen it with SIM swapping to bypass MFA, we've seen it with push bombing and MFA fatigue to bypass MFA, and ultimately attacker in the middle phishing just slots in there as another technique that works to bypass MFA. It's only after account takeover has been achieved that we get to the point where we have the other actions that affect the environment and the other attack execution. So at this point, this is when, once they've achieved account takeover, we see very rapid actions on objectives. So we see data exfiltrated, and it's generally from SaaS and cloud-based systems. And then we see, in many cases, the very final step is lateral movement into the sort of server and endpoint space. But even then, it tends to be focused on VMware, and that's when we see deployment of ransomware. So there's a very quick sort of account takeover to profit section that happens at the end. But everything leading up there is very much an identity-driven attack and looking at bypassing MFA to get that account takeover in the first place. So thinking about TTP summary here, ultimately Scattered Spider is consciously evading network and endpoint detection controls, right? Your traditional network and endpoint controls, they are skipping them. They are targeting identities. They're bypassing MFA. They're targeting cloud services, particularly for data exfil. And in the very few cases where they actually come to looking at more traditional ransomware attacks and involving the more endpoint orientated bits, even then they're focusing on VMware because they know VMware is the one thing that is not normally covered by EDR in the same way. So even at that point, they're avoiding those traditional endpoint controls. Okay, so it's, they've got a clear MO here. Okay, so how do you actually defend your organization from Scattered Spider? I mean, this is the point where we need to consider that attacks have changed, right? It's probably clear from what we've been over in your minds now, but ultimately, attacks used to begin with endpoint compromise. Okay, we'd have a low privilege endpoint compromise, and then we'd have some kind of privilege escalation and lateral movement to other endpoints, gradually working around the network, and ultimately, eventually, you get to the point where you steal data, maybe you deploy ransomware, whatever your objectives are, and then you profit. The objectives haven't really changed. In this case, Scattered Spider are stealing data and they're deploying ransomware and they're profiting. But the route they take there has changed. They're now going via the identity route. They're almost entirely skipping the endpoint and network route. And those things are not tied to the existing endpoint controls. So that's the thing. We need to understand the attacks have changed, and therefore we need to focus our efforts in line with how they've changed. So ultimately, tackling identity is key. If we look back at this diagram before, you think about the whole bit where you need to really be taking action, which is up until the point of account takeover. You really need to be focused ideally on this stage. All of this is identity. Everything they're doing here is in the identity space. Your endpoint controls, your network controls, your email gateways, so forth. They're not going to help you much here. Really, once they get onto the actions in the environment and the attack execution, it's way too late. You can have some controls there, but really we need to be focused on these earlier stages, preventing the account takeover in the first place. And ultimately, this is entirely happening in the identity space. So I don't have time to go through lots of different recommendations here, and a webinar is maybe not the best format for it. So I'm gonna highlight a few things, but I'm also gonna reference a really interesting blog post here. So Mandiant released a great blog post here that's got a lot of recommendations. If you're looking for the bullet pointed recommendations across different phases, I'd definitely check that out. I stuck a QR code there for that. But let's just consider a few for the purposes here. So one part, if we're looking at the help desk process, would be to say, let's not use mobile cell phones as part of the help desk verification process, right? So we've seen obviously lots of successful attacks bypassing this help desk process. And sometimes one thing we'll see is that part of the standard process in help desks is to involve a callback to a number on file. Not all help desks even do this. They may have no verification step beyond asking for information. But for some help desks, they may look at a number on file that's been registered as an authenticate number and call back as part of the verification process. However, if we're looking at the techniques they've used, things like SIM swapping, you can't necessarily trust that as much. So it's worth considering trying to use IAM or some other alternative for these kind of verification methods that doesn't involve a number that can be spoofed. The other process to consider is that we shouldn't be using the same help desk process for all accounts. Now, this is super common, but ultimately it's a key part of the problem. What we see is that there is one help desk process that governs the reset for all accounts, okay? And that includes your super admins that have extremely high levels of privileges, and they're lumped in with your sort of general 99% user base. That's always going to create a single point of failure. And ultimately, in an ideal world, you should not handle resets for admin accounts the same way you do for your 99% of general users. And you need to be prepared to introduce friction there. Ultimately, you need to be thinking about things like multi-party approval, maybe deploying passkeys to your most privileged users. Let's say you've struggled to do something like passkey deployment across your entire organization, or even if you've managed that, which few organizations have, maybe you can't get to a point of mandating it so there's no fallback mechanism. But potentially you could achieve that level of high security for a small group of 1% of your highest admins. Ultimately, you need to create a delay in place for suspicious or high-risk scenarios. It could even involve in some of these scenarios someone having to go into an office or whatever the case may be. But ultimately, you do need to be prepared to introduce friction for those highest privileged accounts to make sure they can't be compromised in one step through this method. So that's really important too. Another consideration would be to sort of decouple a user directory from vCenter admin. So I think it's worth considering that the sort of cloud and hypervisor layer could be considered as almost like a tier -1, one step like above your identity admin. Ultimately, if you do get a significant identity level compromise at the sort of admin level, in many cases, it's really as simple as just adding a user to a certain group, and then your entire VMware hypervisors can be accessed, and that's where you've got these really intense ransomware attacks coming in. It's worth trying to decouple the few users you've got for vCenter admin away from your main identity store and having that as another layer that needs to be breached. And finally, I think just generally, let's say, okay, look, we need layer defenses much earlier in the attack chain. This is where we need to be thinking about achieving better protections before account takeover, or at least providing some triggers that may catch some of the initial actions on objectives after it. So, this could be simple, common things, making strict conditional access policies, or maybe triggering alerts if backdoors are put into your identity provider. So, for example, one of the techniques that was seen in an earlier compromise of Okta was that once they compromised Okta, they added a new identity provider, something called Inbound Federation, that enabled them to then authenticate as any user they liked. You can put alerts in place for that. We've also seen evidence of them putting filters in place to remove events from CloudWatch if they're messing around in AWS, for example. You could put alerts in place for that. So, these are some of the other things to consider. And in general, given that they're so active in the cloud space, you need to make sure you're getting logs from your at least your core cloud and SaaS services, or you're going to be completely blind to the actions they take because they're not taking actions on the endpoint and network in that way. So to recap, okay, look, ScatterSpider is ultimately an identity-first threat actor, very skilled in bypassing MFA, and they have multiple tricks for doing that, okay? And in particular, they're consciously bypassing your standard established controls at the endpoint and network layer that everyone in the industry has been focused on for the last 10, 20 years. They're avoiding those, and they're primarily targeting cloud services. And ultimately, they've got a range of different identity-based TTPs that achieve this. It's not just help desk attacks. They've been a pretty key component in some of the most public breaches, but there are various other identity-based techniques they use to achieve their goals as well. Okay, so that concludes the main part of the webinar. So I just want to spend a small amount of time talking about what we do in push in this space before we wrap up. So ultimately, in push, we're focused on identity attacks. Yes, that's why we're interested in this space. It's been, the focus for us, and we do this by being based in the browser. We have a browser extension that means we see all the identities and access that a user has. So we've got a few different things that fit into this space and prevent breaches before they achieve account takeover. Yeah, so we've got verified stolen credential detection, for example. We can detect if stolen credentials are in use by users and where they're using them and what that allows access to. We've got things like MFA enforcement, so we can, if we've got lots of accounts outside of IDPs that are not using MFA, we can enforce users to use them and gradually improve that security. We've got a lot of different detection and prevention controls, specifically with regard to attacker in the middle phishing kits, and that's something that in the browser we can conduct in a much better way than traditional controls like email gateways. We've even introduced some sort of verification codes recently, which I'll cover in a second, for help desks and so forth. So we've got a whole bunch of techniques here. I'm not going to go into everything push does, but I'm just going to show you a couple of things briefly so you get the idea that we're trying to operate at this identity layer. So I'm going to show you a criminal attack in the middle phishing kit. I'm not going to show you Evil Jinx this time. I'm going to show you a different one. But I just want to show a couple of the phishing controls here and how it works in the browser so it makes sense. So we've effectively got pre-auth and post-auth type techniques here. So we have some that will flag sort of known phishing kits we're aware of, or other common techniques like cloned login pages. So something sort of looks like a Microsoft page or a Google page or an Okta page and so forth. We can detect that aspect rather than the kit itself, because that's normally what we see attack in the middle phishing kits doing. But as a catch-all sort of zero-day protection, we also have something called SSO password protection, and that means because we're in the browser, we know what your password is for different systems, or rather we can observe it. Okay, so the browser itself knows, and we can fingerprint that locally. So we know if you're entering one password into the wrong website, and we can stop that. So if you try and enter your Okta password into a phishing site, we can literally see you do it and stop you and alert your SIM. So I'm going to show both of these things. And essentially, for the phishing tool detections and the cloned login page detections that happen pre-auth, I've set these just to monitor only so they don't interfere with the user, and we'll just see the sort of SIM result of this afterwards. But if the SSO password protection I've put into warning mode, which effectively is going to block the user. And let's consider a different delivery vector. So we'll consider Slack this time. So some kind of phishing that doesn't come via email. So this is at the time I recorded this was a live phishing kit. Also protected by Cloudflare turnstile. That's really common with attacker kits to stop them being analyzed by security forces. And in this case, we've got a voicemail emulation. So this particular trick is making it seem like you have a voicemail. And when you click this, it prompts you to sort of reauth to Microsoft. And it's already filled out the username as well. You just have to enter your password. And at this point, I'm going to enter my IDP password for my test account, and you can see us kicking in at that point and saying, no, you've used your SSO password, you can't do that. And it stopped the attack, stopped the MFA bit from occurring after that, and we'll have also got an alert for that sent centrally, which can be sent to our SIM as well. So I'm just going to show you the events here. You should see, okay, that new SSO password event just appeared there a couple of seconds after it happened. But also, although I had it in monitor mode only, we'd already got a cloned login page detection prior to the password even being entered, because we observed that it looked like a Microsoft login page that wasn't on, obviously, a known Microsoft URL. So that's just like a quick idea of what we do on the phishing side. Say we do many other things, but I just wanted to show one quick example of how we fit in there. So the other thing to mention, this is actually very new, but it's interesting because it relates to the help desk element here. We did have a customer recently that requested this from us. They wanted verification codes that would be easily available in the browser to users, and they asked us and said, oh, hey, you've got an extension. Can't you make these things really easily available as like a light touch verification feature that if someone asks an employee, they can get them to verify that they've got a code if they have access to, say, their device still, but they've locked out of other accounts and maybe they've still got access to a browser, or at least they're with someone like a colleague that maybe still has that access. It at least gives them some idea of, you know, a light touch verification step that they physically possess or have access to a device with a web browser at that point. Obviously, this is not a complete and utter solution to help desk issues. I don't want to overplay it here. It's just a light touch verification feature, but our customer asked for it, gave us really good feedback once they got it working. So we decided to just release it to everyone because we realized that it's something that would be useful as a light touch verification feature for help desk processes right now. But ultimately, going forwards, this is something we'd like to provide much more information and features for with people. So we're actually really keen to hear from different companies on what they would like to do in their help desk processes and how we can fit into that. Because think about what your bank does with fraud. You know, you speak to them, not only do you identify yourselves, but they then might say, okay, tell us a direct debit you have going out, and, you know, on what day of the month, and what was the last 3 transactions you did and where were they made. And so they can ask you other verifying bits. And we could do similar things in push with like, which apps are you using for this particular thing? When did you last log into another app? So there's all sorts of things we could potentially do here. And we're just keen to know how we could fit into that process. Okay, so moving on to closing thoughts now. Ultimately, that scattered spider TTPs are being adopted by wider criminal groups. So yes, we need to be thinking about scattered spider, but this is really an evolution of attacks more generally, okay? It's not just help desk scams either. There's many ways of executing identity attacks. Scattered spider, they'll use any means they can to get the job done. But really what we're saying is a pivot towards identity-driven attacks, focusing on cloud services and just completely avoiding the endpoint and network layer where possible and bypassing MFA. So really, we all need to be reviewing our defenses against modern attacks and leveraging identity and cloud-first methods. So I just wanted to come back to this point because I spoke about it at the beginning. I said that this was a topic that's close to my heart from the research I've done in this space before. That's hopefully clearer now by the end of the webinar. So I just wanted to bring this back up and saying that if you want to know more about identity attacks and SaaS attacks, then go check out the SaaS attacks matrix, because it's not just what we've spoken about today. There's actually a huge number of attacks that are relevant in this space, and they're all based around avoiding endpoint and network-based controls and target identity and targeting SaaS and cloud apps. And finally, it's not just scattered spider. So obviously I made the point we're going to see lots of groups adopting these techniques more as time goes on. But look, this has kind of already happened. Like if we look at, say, Shiny Hunters, they're the group that targeted Snowflake last year. That was a very identity-driven attack. If we see, say, Lapsus and APT29 as well, they've also done other attacks more recently where they're very identity driven. There's a lot of parallels with what Scattered Spider do, a lot of MFA bypassing and avoiding the endpoint and so forth. So, it's kind of already not just Scattered Spider. So this is just the movement of the threat landscape. And with that in mind, we'll conclude there and say thank you for listening, and let's take questions.
Thank you very much, everybody, for all of your questions. So we'll start working through those. So the first question here, is a help desk attack where they've posed as a non-help desk staff member and tricked the help desk member to reset their account? Yes, I think we covered that off in the slides there. So hopefully that answered your question, but please drop in again if it's not clear. I'm assuming SIM swapping would require physical access to a phone. Luke, do you want to take that one?
Okay. I think it depends on the telcos, and also you've got eSIMs and stuff now, but it involves a telco process. So it's about swapping the phone number rather than the phone itself so that you can receive calls.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you wouldn't need to physically possess the victim's phone. You are just effectively impersonating, getting their number assigned to you or to your device, to your SIM, to intercept those MFA codes. Okay, next question. For attacker-in-the-middle attacks and sessions being stolen, do passkeys, authenticator, or FIDO help in this scenario?
Okay. Yes. So, passkeys are a great defense against attacker-in-the-middle phishing. I think what you need to understand is there's just a couple of big limitations here. So, the first limitation is that although they're not widely rolled out yet, some people are using them. What we see is it's much less common that people are able to completely enforce and mandate them without the ability to fall back to another method. So we see it's incredibly common that if they're supported, you can still click like verify with something else or try another way depending on the platform. And the problem is attacker-in-the-middle phish kits can force the lower security method if that's the case. And actually, that's not theoretical. There are criminal attacker-in-the-middle phishing kits out there already do that. They already forcibly go through that route of try another way or whatever. So they only really work when you don't allow any fallback mechanism whatsoever. The other aspect for them is that most of the time, for the few companies out there that have really set them up properly so far, it tends to be for your identity provider. And obviously you want as many apps as you can sitting under that. But from what we do at Push, we can tell you that the reality of cloud identities out there is much broader. Huge numbers of identities people have actually sit outside of identity providers. And so, obviously they're only ever going to be able to cover part of the phishing there.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. I'll take this one. Do you know how financially successful Scattered Spider actually are? Are their victims paying and sponsoring their next few projects? I think it's important to bear in mind that these groups can make money outside of the direct ransoms, and it's often quite difficult to track ransom payments. So going back on the historic breaches, for example, we know, for example, that the Caesars attack back in the day involved a ransom payment. We don't have the full picture from a lot of the other breaches, but also bear in mind that these are potentially different individuals, so they may not have directly benefited from those payments in the past. However, one way they can make and do make money is through the resale of data online. So effectively, selling the data to other criminals, and also then extorting the individuals impacted. So we've seen in the past sort of extortion campaigns ran against individuals after they've kind of worked their way through the impacted companies and they kind of work their way down the chain. So there are lots of ways that these people make money. They can then also use the data for like fraud and things like that, or indeed other connected groups can and pay them for the data. So it's a complex sort of network, but we can assume that, it's paying enough for them to keep doing this. And yeah, certainly somebody is profiting at some stage in the chain. Okay, did they exploit a vulnerability in VMware in order to encrypt the VMs, i.e. were the VMware environments not fully patched? Do you want to take that one?
No, so I mean, I think generally with this, it's legitimate access to ESX basically so their compromised identities work their way up to the point where they have admin access to those things, and they're just they're logging in successfully and running binaries or issuing kind of native commands to do this. It's not an exploit as such.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. Have you seen attacker in the middle threat actors working around FIDO2 methods?
Okay, I kind of answered that before with the discussion on passkeys. So yes, ultimately, like that, there are criminal kits out there that already automatically downgrade passkeys. It's actually quite simple methods sometimes. So to elaborate, like, often it's a little bit of JavaScript or automatically locate buttons to do try another way or verify with something else and like auto click them through the process. And there's various methods of doing it, but yes, here's a summary. They do work around them.
I think, we can also look at like the research that happens and how that often sort of precedes changes in attacker techniques as well. Like, we saw the device code phishing sort of research recently and things like that. So yeah, the more that passkeys become adopted, I think the more that we will probably see bypasses emerge and then become more mainstream. But right now, I think, yeah, the sort of downgrade style phishing attacks is sufficient to get around most, because, based on the research that we conducted last year, it's less than 1% effectively of accounts have only a phishing resistant method. Like 99% plus of accounts have at least a backup method that is phishable. So yeah, it's still a problem even with sort of passkeys and FIDO. Okay, I've noticed I see less advice to share IOCs when intrusion attempts or successful intrusions have been detected. Would it still be worthwhile encouraging sharing of intrusion IOCs to close the gap between APT group signals and defense against them?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so I think there's two aspects to this. Like, traditional IOCs aren't always that valuable because they typically change so much now. So if you're talking about the sort of bad domains and IPs and that kind of thing, it's good to know them. But realistically, these days, it's always backwards looking, and every new thing that's coming around is going to be just something new. So they're only of limited, value there. But I think definitely the sort of the higher level attack techniques, like what they're doing, the sort of the tactics they're using, is very valuable to share. And I think then there's just obviously, there's a sort of blurry ground event. Maybe when things are more current and there's more details, you might not want to share them like on the internet, but having sort of community groups within industries and liaising with people like the NCSC, if you're in the UK, those kind of things definitely are very, very valuable.
I suppose there's also a secondary point there, which is most IOCs are going to be generated from like the endpoint aspect of the attack that's occurring towards the end of the kill chain, really. Like, I imagine there are fewer IOCs generated towards the sort of initial access account takeover aspect of the attack. So most of your data that you'd be sharing probably comes, it's still definitely worth sharing, but you probably want to be building controls, as Luke said in the presentation earlier, in the kill chain, as opposed to like the endpoint component that occurs at the end with the ransomware deployment and those sorts of things. I don't know, would you agree with that typically, Luke?
Yeah, I think also, there's a lot of classic IOCs are quite host and network orientated, and there's fewer examples of them in the identity space.
Cool, excellent. Okay. The extension that Push has in the browser is also pulling some browser level logs from the browser and sends them to the SIEM. What type of logs are used by the detection rules you presented? So I think what kind of detection rules can we feed with the telemetry that we collect?
Yeah, okay. I mean, in terms of the detection we do, it's not like we're looking at logs and then doing the detection as much. It's we send out alert level logs for detections as well as lots of other logs. But really, the detection side that we have and why we're focused on it in the browser is because we've got access to data you just don't have any elsewhere. Like, we're able to literally look at the entire DOM and inspect it and subscribe to events and and monitor clicks and keystroke. Like we can do anything in the browser. We can see visually what the user is seeing. So you saw there was a demo I gave where I very briefly mentioned Cloudflare Turnstile at the beginning of the attacker in the middle phishing site. Almost every phishing site out there now uses some kind of capture or turnstile or something to prevent automated analysis of them, because most other scrapers and other things, the sandboxes out there, go and look at it, they detect that, they prevent them by using techniques like that, whereas we see what the user sees. So ultimately, we've got all sorts of things we can analyze inside the browser to decide if we think something is phishing, and then the log we send out is just a notification of like, yeah, we think this app was phishing and we blocked it. But we send out lots of other things as well. In general, we see every login method to every app and how someone's logged in, even if they've logged in directly and it's not via an IDP, or if they've used SAML, if they've used social logins like Google logins, Microsoft logins, that kind of thing. So we give a lot more visibility that I didn't demonstrate today in the product generally. There's a lot of other features too.
Great, thank you. Fantastic presentation. Well, thank you. Any thoughts on how we sell our senior leadership on the delay friction suggestion? I think in terms of their help desk aspect, I completely agree. But any tips to get their buy-in?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best bit with that is that you're going to be. You can obviously calculate from your own admin groups and so forth what the breakdown of percentages are, but you're talking about in particular creating a lot of friction for a small percentage of accounts that are going to be like 95% of the risk. So I think that's a good sort of trade-off to go by. Obviously, when you get to the general improvement controls for any accounts, it's a little more difficult. And yeah, I mean, you've got to try and demonstrate what the cost is. I mean, if you say, well, look, this cost Marks and Spencer £300 million, maybe we should do something about it. Maybe some of those things would help. But yeah, the wider thing is obviously going to be a harder conversation.
Yeah, I think there's, it's an unfortunate reality, but there's no better time to be, championing a change in your help desk process than right now, when these attacks are in the news. And yeah, there are very public, visible impacts of these attacks that I think you can talk to, that business people will and business leaders will clearly understand in terms of financial impact. So yeah, I think and also the fact that the disruption is going to be localized potentially to your most high risk accounts, right? Which people shouldn't be resetting on a daily basis. I think the actual time impact or delay aspect of that will be negligible for legitimate cases. You're probably just closing off these kind of abuse cases anyway. So yeah, I think there's a few arguments you can make there. Will the physical use of a key such as YubiKey be safer for admin credentials? Yes. Yes, the answer. Yeah.
But basically, links to everything we talked about in terms of passkeys and FIDO and stuff. Yeah, YubiKeys just really fit into that. So it's kind of the same answer as yes, but with the caveats we gave previously.
Yeah, similar question to one we had earlier, but do you think the industry could be doing a better job of sharing TI and more information to enable these attacks to be prevented? I think I'll give a little bit. I think, it is always tough with these things where the reality doesn't really hit the headlines. And in particular, what we've seen at the moment is like all of the mainstream news coverage is very good from a awareness perspective, but it's obfuscating the details quite a lot. Like for example, the nuances around Dragon Force and versus Scattered Spider and all that sort of stuff is, it creates a lot of noise. And I think, generally more transparency and more open transparency would be helpful to a lot of organizations. I think the reality is we only see the public things, and it's just the tip of the iceberg, really, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned it earlier in the presentation, Luke, but those public breaches that we're referring to are not the entirety of the TTPs that these organizations are using, or these criminal groups are using. Would you add anything to that?
No, I think it's a very good summary.
Cool. What are your thoughts on not forcing passwords to expire regularly? Seems like more complex and less changes stronger, accepting other protective measures are also in place.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think the old sort of change of password every 30 days thing is old-fashioned advice, really. It's better to have a good, strong password for longer and reset it if there are good reasons to do so. And then, obviously, reduce general password usage through SSO where possible, and use password managers to manage individual randomized passwords for other things. So yeah, I think the whole kind of, oh, you should change your password every 30 days is very old hat.
Yeah. There are a lot of questions. I think we're going to keep going, I think, because there's a lot of questions, but yeah, bear with us if we haven't got to your question yet. So how do they identify high privileged accounts to targets, e.g. admins to VMware? I think it's just social engineering largely, isn't it? Like LinkedIn, yeah.
LinkedIn, I think is a big part of it. You know, you want to target an Okta admin, you go and see who works at the company and says that they're an Okta admin, you know, it's those kind of things. It's definitely a part of it, and then combined with social engineering.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, they're also going for a spread of accounts. They're not just going for one specific account there. They have like a short list, and I guess they operate almost as like a business development function might, or something like that. They are targeting a number of accounts, calling at different times to see which help desk people they can get access to, who they can social engineer, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think it's pretty easy if you search for high-level IT professionals on LinkedIn for an organization to be able to impersonate their accounts. Okay, after dropping the malicious payload, the payload is usually executed via PowerShell. According to you, would it be ideal to block PowerShell command execution in endpoints at all, allowing only access via manual intervention with admin privilege?
I mean, it's not really so related to what some of the techniques they're using. But I mean, generally having good application control, which includes script execution like PowerShell on endpoints, is definitely a positive thing to do from an endpoint perspective.
How did they successfully bypass IDS, IPS? I think it generally comes back to the point of like they are taking over control of these high privilege accounts and then authenticating to the particular VMware environment. And pulling data from cloud and SaaS services where IDS, IPS often isn't, you know, it's not a traditional network environment, right? So yeah, I think they're effectively, as Luke was saying, bypassing the network and endpoint component as much as possible. At the point you're deploying the ransomware at the VMware hypervisor there's no IDS or IPS in that environment that can stop you. Same as no EDR running in that environment. Once you're in that, at that sort of plane of execution, they're basically away, and they've got there through identity. Would you add anything to that, Luke?
No, I think that's good.
Cool. I'm just gonna. Okay. Is it better to use authentication MFA methods with hardware tokens than phones?
I mean, I'd say in general yes, but like I've got one. I've got a YubiKey plugged into my laptop now that I use for lots of things, even as far as signing individual Git commits through our code. So I would say yes, but I think, you know, you can get other methods based that operate as passkeys on phones now too, or embedded into the TPM device separately. So it's more about what attacks the specific MFA method protects against. So if it is a phishing resistant method, which with FIDO, which isn't just hardware tokens, it's generalized passkeys which go slightly outside of that, then that is a positive thing, and that's the main component of it.
Yeah, great. Okay, I think that's probably all we've got time for there now. But I would just say that everybody will receive a copy of the recording to their email. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much for all of your excellent questions. If any of you are in the UK and you're attending InfoSec next week, we'll be at booth B30. So yeah, both of us. So please come down, ask your questions. We can chat about the webinar there. But yeah, thank you very much for attending. And yeah, we'll hopefully see you soon. Bye.